And so, for better or for worse, right now, the forward direction is figuring out how to connect Bitcoin to existing capital markets globally. And if you're not interested in that, there are other places you can go to have other conversations about Bitcoin. I just think that's the next 10 years of the conversation. I really don't think we're going to go back to the 2021 era of sort of grassroots global rebellion, against the system. I feel like Bitcoin sort of aged out of that period. As a journalist, to be around the interesting stories, right? What's going to happen with JP Morgan and MSTR? What's going to happen with Michael Saylor? I think Saylor turned on a lot of people who were not in the Bitcoin culture before, right? I talked to a lot of people at businesses who are like, the guy at a big insurance company who loves Bitcoin treasuries. They look at it every day and they get their friends and colleagues interested in it. And it's like, what I hear from them pretty consistently is that Michael Saylor just spoke to them in a way that they understood it and they could evangelize this to their peers, and that hadn't happened for them before.
Hey everybody, Tyler here, and today at Treasury Orange, I'm talking to Pete Rizzo, who's been covering Bitcoin as a journalist and historian for over a decade. Pete is the president of BitcoinTreasuries.net, the definitive data source tracking corporate Bitcoin holdings, and he hosts the Supply Shock podcast. He's witnessed and documented every major moment in Bitcoin's evolution. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. Yeah, excited to jump in. And certainly, sounds like we're both thinking in the same direction. Bitcoin treasuries have been the theme and the meta for this year. And, I think my bet is that it's going to continue, but we'll see.
Awesome. I think we're aligned on that, Pete. So you've been covering Bitcoin for a long time, and obviously Bitcoin treasuries are what's hot this cycle. But can you take us back, and what was Bitcoin like when you started covering it? How did you begin covering it and all that?
Yeah, that's a way back question, but I just got out of college. I was a journalism major. I was looking for people to help me, pursue that career. So essentially, was out of Boston, had some friends who were working on financial writing. I didn't know much about finance other than what I sort of knew about being loosely, tangentially interested in the Occupy Wall Street movements. Just sort of fell into it, right? A crazy story. I was writing stories about people who had struck it rich on internet money and who were arguing kind of about the future of finance. So, really just fell into it, Bitcoin, because it was a great story. And so, I had to learn everything backwards: the finance part, the computer science part, the fundraising and startup development part. And obviously all that came over time. But it's been a pretty crazy journey. I always thought, that looking back, that there would have been a very kind of like business, finance, professional period of Bitcoin. It's happened a little bit earlier than I expected, right? But I think, that's kind of the vanguard of adoption now. If you think about the stories that I was writing, my first story for CoinDesk, back when it was maybe an idea of 5 people together thinking about making a website, was merchants accepting Bitcoin. And at that time, they were accepting Bitcoin, but most of them were selling it for dollars. There was this idea that Bitcoin would sort of be this payments rail, but the currency would sort of be secondary to, other components. Obviously, there's a little inversion with the treasury companies today where some of them are accepting Bitcoin and now they're holding it because Bitcoin has proven to be a store of value over time. So I don't know, right? It was a business story back then in some respects. My first beat for CoinDesk was covering major merchant processors and payment companies that were looking at Bitcoin, right? Because that's sort of how Bitcoin was becoming mainstream at that time. There were companies like Overstock, Expedia that were accepting Bitcoin, and it was sort of viewed as a subset of the financial conversation, but as fintech, right? Fintech was kind of just emerging, as Cash App, well, Square was pretty new and novel at that point. And so, Bitcoin was sort of a subset of this larger financial innovation, but it was very much an internet story and a business story. And I think it's come back to those roots after actually kind of coming through a interesting counterculture period. But again, it's been a fascinating story through and through.
That's really cool. So with Bitcoin treasuries, the story is kind of, a digitization of credit story led by Michael Saylor. And the store of value piece, like you touched on, is, really important to these Bitcoin treasury companies who are stacking and just see Bitcoin as the premier capital asset. How far off do you think widespread adoption of Bitcoin as payments is? We recently saw Jack Dorsey's company Square kind of turn that on in this past quarter. You can pay with Bitcoin at certain participating merchants. But do you think that medium of exchange story is still really essential to Bitcoin? Is it a long way off?
I mean, it's like a network connectivity issue at this point, right? So the analogy that I always used to think through this is, the printer, right? That there's kind of cudgels as you go from analog to the digital world, right? And you and I probably grew up with printers. There's probably a lot of Gen Zs might be listening to this, never used a printer, and then there was a whole multi decades where pretty much everything digitally sort of passed through a printer, right? And so I think about it the same way. I think payments is a last mile problem, and it really gets solved once most people and companies are onboarded to Bitcoin. I have a little joke that I've been selling recently, where it's like sort of every Bitcoin cycle, we expect the narrative to be something other than people buying and holding Bitcoin, and then lo and behold, the the meta of the cycle is people buying and holding Bitcoin. And so that's kind of, I think, what you see in a network where again, like back in the 90s and 80s, like you couldn't send an email and then rely that someone would be able to see it, right? They didn't necessarily have a device. If they had a device, it might have been at their university or at their house. They might have not been with them traveling, right? So you sort of had this asymmetry between sending a piece of digital communication and then someone physically accessing it through a device, right? Now I'm surrounded by 7 or 8 devices, right? So there's a ubiquity problem, but now I think if I was to message you, there's 10 ways to do it digitally. And I think you're going to see something similar with Bitcoin, right? It's the sort of the network type adoption. So with these companies, right? So there's 400 companies on BitcoinTreasuries.net right now, public, private. That's gone up from like about 30 at the start of the year, right? There's really been a huge hockey stick. There's 10,000, 50,000 companies globally, right? I've been saying it's 2013 in Bitcoin businesses, right? Like if Michael Saylor really brought something kind of new and interesting to the Bitcoin conversation, I think it's increasingly that while individuals can use Bitcoin to save and get ahead, companies can too. And so then there's all the derivative questions that have come with that, which is, okay, well, if the business is not in Bitcoin, how do they operate? If they do have an attitude where they're pro Bitcoin and biased against the financial system, how do they arbitrage that opportunity? I look at it from a interesting question standpoint. I like to position my work around sort of the key questions of the time. And so right now I see a lot of the interesting questions in Bitcoin around this corporate adoption story. It's true businesses are adopting Bitcoin. I think it's true that most businesses will adopt Bitcoin. And I think it's true that right now we live in a period of time where people are still confident in the fiat system and Bitcoin hasn't taken over. And so there are arbitrage opportunities for that. The interesting question then is, how do these public companies deal with stockholders? And I think that's where a lot of the friction has been this year, and sort of, this three-party system of institutions funding companies and then retail shareholders getting involved. And it's a learning process, right? There's been this idea that the Bitcoin treasury space has like moved so fast. And I'd say it's like, oh, really? It's like Michael Saylor was buying Bitcoin with the company money, that he started to leverage selling his own shares to do that. And now he's moved into this idea that he can sell equity and dividends, in perpetuity with these credit products, and that's sort of it, right? Like it actually is a pretty recent maturation of his ideas. And if you listen to Saylor and kind of scrub away, some of his great metaphors, right? He's great at imagery. I think he'll sort of say it, right, where he's sort of put it all together at the end of 2024, where he figured out that essentially he could use Bitcoin in different ways. He AI'd how old kind of financial products work back on a gold standard. And, he's sort of launched this out into the ether, for lack of a better word. And yeah, there's 3 companies today that are offering some form of digital credit. There's maybe less than 10 or 12 that are doing preferreds. You can go to BitcoinTreasury.net and download our recent monthly Bitcoin corporate adoption report that kind of gets into this, but it's early stages, right? And I think that overall, it's an experimentation period. And, we do seem to now be getting with some dissatisfaction with, the dilute the shareholders model to raise Bitcoin. But people are coming to market with new ideas, right? You're seeing operating businesses that are associated with major companies launch. You got XE out in the UK. You've got companies that are doing, active treasury management, like Falcon Edge is another interesting company. So, there's companies that are coming out and doing interesting things. And I think my bet is that you're just, when I say it's 2013 in Bitcoin businesses, the idea is that businesses can adopt Bitcoin, but then there's 1,000 questions that come from that. And you're sort of dealing with that. And I think people need a place to connect and answer those questions. And so with BitcoinTreasuries.net, it's social media, it comes to the news, email, you've got your analysis and your research. And then of course on the site daily, you get to see real-time updates of, companies globally buying Bitcoin. And so, we really want to be at the center of the conversation. I don't think we have the answers to that conversation, right? I don't think it's the job of a publication necessarily to provide answers. But what publications can do that's pretty interesting is that they can get constituents together and they can take a snapshot of kind of what's going on at any state and time. And, the state and time of Bitcoin businesses right now, I think it's really interesting. MSTR and Michael Saylor have a big head start. There's a lot of companies following. I think outside of strategy and Metaplan, it's anyone's guess of what's going to happen.
Cool. And I think most of our viewers are obviously familiar with your site, bitcointreasuries.net. Like you said, what made you want to get involved there and track the analytics and bring these kind of ideas together, Pete?
I think, as I said, the story, right? I watched what happened with strategy, and I think I got it at first, right? But I think I had the same distance most people had from the idea. I spent a lot of time with Dylan LeClaire, who used to work at Bitcoin Magazine alongside myself. He was kind of early into a lot of these ideas. I was sort of there to kind of see the meta plan get developed, and you could just see that idea at the end of 2014 kind of really take off and take on a life of its own. And there were a lot of people who wanted to get in on the activity. And obviously, BitcoinTreasuries.net had been around, for a few years, mostly as kind of a project that people had kind of put together and that were working on asynchronously. I had contributed to it just as a journalist because it was a great resource. And again, my history has been building media products, CoinDesk, Bitcoin Magazine, now Bitcoin Treasuries, and to me, that's where the conversation was going. It's Bitcoin had sort of moved from the counterculture stage. It was pretty clear that Bitcoin is now mainstream. It might not be the most mainstream thing, but it's pretty mainstream within circles. And the Bitcoin Treasury story kind of felt like where the puck is going. And I actually still feel that way. I actually think that broadly there isn't much interesting in Bitcoin right now. People watch my podcasts, we go over the knots and sort of core software debates, mostly for fun because it's an interesting intellectual exercise. But I don't, really think there's much forward direction there. And so, for better or for worse, right now the forward direction is figuring out how to connect Bitcoin to existing capital markets globally. And if you're not interested in that, there are other places you can go to have other conversations about Bitcoin. I just think that's the next 10 years of the conversation. I really don't think we're going to go back the 2021 era of sort of grassroots global rebellion, against the system. I feel like Bitcoin sort of aged out of that period. I know you had Matt Odell on this podcast earlier this week. I'm sure he, gave an impassioned plea for that. And I told him, myself, look, if you give me a time machine, I can go back to 2021, I'll do it. But I don't have a time machine. And so the next best thing is I got to follow the Bitcoin story. And, the Bitcoin story right now is going through Wall Street. It's the Trojan horse going through the door. And I just think that, you want to kind of, as a journalist, be around the interesting stories, right? What's going to happen with JP Morgan and MSTR? What's going to happen with Michael Saylor? Does it sustain? What happens to these 300 companies that followed him? Do they all find success? Do they get acquired? Because they own Bitcoin. Right? They own Bitcoin at the end of the day. They are acquiring Bitcoin. And if you look at the data on our site, they're buying Bitcoin at a rate that's still pretty unprecedented. Yeah, look, I mean, a lot of people sort of want to know where we're going. And I sort of look at it where it's like, well, you can't really know maybe necessarily where we're going, but, you can kind of see the context, right? And this is the interesting area of context, which is mainstream finance is here, financial analysts are here, your wealth managers are here. These are just a group of people that just weren't in Bitcoin earlier, right? I think I say this to a lot of people where it's, you just really didn't see the cottage industry and professional people that you see now are the accountants, lawyers. If you look at the directory on bitcointreasuries.net, the kinds of partners that you have there were people who have traditional financial backgrounds are interested in the sector at all. It's pretty new, but that's happens. And look, Bitcoin is finance, right? And I think that now you're seeing that question be answered of, well, how does Bitcoin become part of global finance and the established system now that it has disrupted the system enough to be accommodated by it?
Cool. Yeah, that's really interesting framing of kind of that, I'd say, delicate balance between, the cypherpunk ethos and now that Wall Street and finance are here. I think both will keep contributing to Bitcoin's adoption and culture. But like you said, there's definitely shifts in what the dominant narrative is. I think strategy was kind of the prequel to this finance story. And to me, the real signpost of that Wall Street was here was the ETFs being approved in the United States.
Well, I think Saylor turned on a lot of people who were not in the Bitcoin culture before, right? I talked to a lot of people at businesses who are like, the guy at a big insurance company who loves Bitcoin treasuries. They look at it every day and they get their, friends and colleagues interested in it. And it's like, what I hear from them pretty consistently is that Michael Saylor just spoke to them in a way that they understood it and they could evangelize this to their peers, and that hadn't happened for them before, right? And so I think that as a person who's a journalist and a historian, it's like I mostly deal with people, right? And what you learn with people is that, sometimes things aren't absolute. Sometimes there's relative truths, right? And the relative truth is that Michael Saylor convinced a lot of people who weren't interested in Bitcoin before to be interested in Bitcoin. Those folks have now sort of formed a large social group, and they are connecting and sharing ideas and getting active, and they are working within their established known domain to move Bitcoin forward, right? Whether that fully aligns with kind of Bitcoin values, et cetera, right? I think that's an interesting conversation, but I think it's a derivative of this larger question. I do think also, like, looking at 2026, right? There's this question of like the Bitcoin halving is becoming less important, right? We're seeing this 2026 people saying, oh, well, the Bitcoin price, the 4-year cycle is dead, right? Okay, well, so if the halving isn't the reason that Bitcoin is going up over time anymore, if Bitcoin, 95% of Bitcoin is distributed, it's not getting more scarce at a steeper curve, right? It's actually the other inverse of that. The open question that I see right now in Bitcoin, now that the financial industry has adopted it, they've kind of siloed it in their narrative, right? It's a hedge against the debasement. Larry Fink says it's a asset of fear. Is that, my worry there is that, like, with that understanding comes with just complacency where they don't take action. Like, so it's possible to understand something and then not take action. So I think a lot of people in finance right now are saying, oh, okay, like Bitcoin, we get it, digital gold. I'm just not interested in digital gold, right? So there's no reason for them. They might understand it, but they're not taking the action. And so I think with the Bitcoin treasury companies that they're like the only thing in the market right now that has an answer for that. So why do you need an urgency to acquire Bitcoin? Sure, Bitcoin is getting scarce over time, but a lot of people know that, right? And have still decided not to be in the market. And so I think the question then becomes, well, there's these companies that are demanding it and using it as collateral. That sort of becomes the reason. I don't see a lot of other answers to that out there in the culture, right? There could be maybe other answers to that question. But if you think about it, it's like what is providing the urgency for Bitcoin demand, right? What is the counter to the answer that Wall Street wants to put forward? And we know that they want to put this forward because we've seen this in the headline in the videos, which is they want us to think that Bitcoin IPO'd, it's over. Bitcoin's digital gold, it's at market saturation. Maybe it'll go up 10 to 20% over the next, 10 years, but it's over. We've got it. We'll take it from here, guys. See you later. Larry's got it. That's what they want to sell, right? And so there needs to be something that breaks that. And I think the Bitcoin treasury companies that have the best answer to that. I'm not saying they give the only answer to that. Right now, they have the best answer to that because in order to collateralize these financial products that Michael Saylor has envisioned, you need to buy Bitcoin. And then, of course, the question is how many of these financial products are going to be created? How many of them will be successful? Which markets they're going to be active in? And who wins from that? And I think that's a 5-10 year story. I think we're at the beginning of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, there's not going to be a moment where the world becomes hyper Bitcoinized, probably, but I do think we're going to finally hit a time. And I don't know if it's in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, but we're going to look back over a 5-year, 6-year period and just be like, everyone just gets Bitcoin. Everyone understands that Bitcoin's money. And it's exciting to see these companies kind of tackle that problem that I think is lacking in education. So as you've been studying these, hundreds of companies that are Bitcoin treasuries and kind of more the pure play style, Pete, what ideas for you this year have been the most interesting in the Bitcoin treasury space? And is there a winning idea that maybe every Bitcoin company should adopt?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think right now I see most of this year as kind of a land grab, right? Like people were kind of looking to position, and there was this idea that there would be a winner in every jurisdiction. If I was to tell the narrative and story of this year, it was, at the beginning of the year with Metaplanet, right? So strategy happened and strategy was successful and was outperforming Bitcoin. Metaplanet sort of proved you can move that to a new jurisdiction in 2024 by being one of the best performing stocks. And they did that in Japan. And so there was a few reasons why Metaplanet was so successful. One is they had a great team, Simon and Dylan and the folks over there. Two is that there was, institutional barriers to adoption. There was no ETFs, there was prohibitive taxation, and there was unfriendly regulation. So there was three reasons why Metaplanet was really successful. And so this year, I think most of the narrative has been a race to see if that model could be exported to more countries. And so, you really didn't see a lot of innovation on the model. You saw a lot of rapid execution to get to market. So, UK, Germany, France, Brazil, every country got their, treasury company. And that took a lot of people getting to market, a lot of service providers, and there was a tremendous amount of capital that was deployed getting those folks to market. And of course, a lot of those, folks are still, there's, almost 100 companies in the US, there's, 50 odd in Canada, there's 20 odd in the UK. So there's big consolidations in areas where there's competition to be the winner in the jurisdiction. So caveat on that is that I don't think it is clear that they're the jurisdictional winners is even necessarily true, right? Michael Saylor has now moved into foreign markets and is selling his digital credit products out there in Europe and abroad and using that to fund more purchases. So that was interesting about it. But I think that there was this jurisdictional jockeying that's sort of been played out. And then the second narrative that I would say was the sort of the collapse of the ATM model, which is, shareholders were everybody was winning, stocks were going up, people were getting diluted, stock was still going up. That was the model, which is sell equity, buy Bitcoin. Right? That has also collapsed as being like the preferred model. Strategy has pivoted out of that. Most of the other firms that were doing that have pivoted out of that. And then treasury companies 3 through 300 are stuck in that trade. Either they haven't executed or they tried to execute it. I think obviously the preferred stocks in digital credit are the next vanguard. I think you're probably going to find that there's a huge capital cost that prevents a lot of these companies from entering that market. The big question to me now is like how many of the companies can actually afford, either through compliance and know-how, whatever, to kind of spearhead those products into those markets. And then, so what happens to the rest of the companies, right? That's kind of the other open question. As I said, I think there are people with interesting ideas, right? So there are companies I think that we're seeing right now. I mentioned a few of them at the start that are kind of going the traditional operating company model as an adjunct to this, right? So I think Jack Mallers is trying to kind of take the reins of this narrative, but I think it kind of started outside of him, which is that 21 will probably acquire Strike. They'll probably buy his exchange and then load that up, and there'll be a Bitcoin company that's taking its profits and moving them over to Bitcoin. One of the ones that came out and making a splash this week was XCE that went IPO in the UK, up 30% this week. A subsidiary of a traditional executive recruiting company that was as well established in its market, rolled off a company, did a Bitcoin treasury play, and again, their claim to the market is they're going to be able to buy Bitcoin consistently. There's another company out of the UK that sort of did the same thing. They're a traditional crypto yield generation service, right? So they're trading other people's money, earning a yield. They're saying, okay, well, we'll just do that with our treasury. Like we'll actively manage our treasury, we'll roll those payments over, and we'll buy Bitcoin more actively. And so I think that's the next sort of thing that you're going to see is this idea that the Bitcoin companies are going to become great operating companies. They're going to be consistently profitable. And because they're consistently profitable, they'll buy Bitcoin. Is there another flavor? I don't know. I think the actively managed treasury companies are interesting because if you think about it, a lot of these treasury companies are sitting on largely dormant resources. I know there's an additional risk with operating a treasury at that level, but the Bitcoin miners have done it for a long time, right? They're obviously the most established, piece of the Bitcoin treasury market. And they are in many cases running much more sophisticated strategies than the other companies proper. But look, I would say right now, nobody has the answer. That's what's kind of exciting about it. Other than strategy, which has the scale, has the capital, it has the brand visibility. And I think Metaplanet, which, again, they have a jurisdictional advantage, which, strategy, you can't do anything about it. There really isn't, there's not a clear answer for me. Somebody will have to figure that out. Something will happen. I just can't tell you what it is. And that to me, that's what makes it exciting, right? I don't have the answers, but I think that story is going to be interesting to follow. Right now, if you read our report that came out this week, we estimated, and again, caveating with data here that, we don't always know the purchasing price for companies, right? They don't always report it. We do track when they do report it. So we were able to go through our data and identify about 100 companies, which we thought was, pretty good sample size. And we looked at the cost basis and we found that about 60% of them were underwater for their purchases, right? That's going to be pretty meaningful. I think that's going to, if Bitcoin does stay in the price range where it is, not saying it will, but I would imagine that those companies are going to have to come out and do something interesting and find some way forward. And again, I think these are the narratives that are going to be interesting next year, which is who separates, who are the execution teams. Because I think Adrian Morris says this a lot, and I think this is sort of true, right? Which is that the traditional markets value Bitcoin equities as equities. They don't care about the Bitcoin on the balance sheet. They don't. The retail investors who are buying the stock, right? But it's pretty clear that the equity analysts, are in the cases where we're seeing these, ratings firms come out, they have chosen to view the Bitcoin almost entirely as a liability, right? So whether they've rated strategy, right, they've come out and said that like, this Bitcoin on the balance sheet is just a risk. It's negative money. Obviously we know that's not true. But again, I still think it's sort of they are valued as equities, and you do have to value them as equities. Right? Some of them are down 99%, not because Bitcoin is a bad idea, not because companies owning Bitcoin is a bad idea, but their execution teams are able to actually navigate the market. And so you're going to see a lot of stuff like that happens. Right? These companies, not everyone's going to win. And I think that's what's interesting, right? So you might see 400 companies, it stay around 400 to 600 companies, somewhere in that range. You might just see a lot of people fail and drop off, and then there might be a reconsolidation, and then something might happen, right? But it's hard to say. I think that the digital credit is really, I think, the one where it's going to go. The question is, how many people are able to get in that market? How successful is that market?
Yeah, that's a good rundown, Pete. Here at Treasury Orange, we're trying to educate and provide information to a lot of retail investors who watch the show. I kind of started this too for a lot of my friends manage wealth, and they were asking me a lot of questions about Bitcoin and these Bitcoin treasury companies because they were really running hot this year. So when retail investors are looking to find an entry point, something that we've always tried to educate about is you got to look at these pipe deals. You have to look if there's outstanding warrants. There's a number of things you have to read through the SEC disclosures and filings and whatnot. How do you think about that for someone who's, again, not financial advice officially, but what do you think about when you're trying to educate someone?
We're trying to make it easier, right? So if you go into the data tables, you can find advanced metrics on most of these companies, right? So we are updating the fully diluted share information for all these companies on a quarterly basis. So we do expect going forward to have, proper Bitcoin per share metrics, proper MNAV metrics. It is hard. The data set is 400 companies. Bitcoin Treasury was bootstrapped by a lot of people submitting data. And obviously, we've grown a data team to help manage that data. If you are doing some data on your own and you'd like to submit it, you're free to create an account and do that and help create this public resource. But look, yeah, we want to develop a product for folks who are doing that, right? We have a portfolio tool on the website in beta right now, but we're continuing to test and improve that. But I would say, we get it. We're dealing with a lot of these filings on a daily basis. It's hard to keep track of these things. I think it would be great to have a nice clean API that provides access to all these things. That's going to be a work in progress. But yeah, I think in many cases where even if you have great metrics, to analyze these things, we put out an email today that analyze, strategies recent sale of stock at essentially, below one MNAV. And, there's lots of great citations to our tools that show you how you can get these granular calculations. As I said, still, I think the tooling is going to be built out over years. We're just at the beginning of the market realizing there's a need. BitcoinTreasuries.net right now, I think, has, a Craigslist type experience for people who want that information. Eventually there's going to be, a nice clean product that solves that solution for people who are doing analysis. I hope that we're the ones who built it. I think we have a nice head start, but, again, it's in all markets, you face competition. And so, we're working as hard as we can to improve the product. We love to get feedback. Yeah, look, I mean, in many ways, it's like 2017 for me all over again. I did white paper results on all these different crazy blockchains, and now it's, all these 10Q filings and, all these companies were buried inside. There's some weird caveat about, them selling a warrant and some shares or something. Again, I think it's all part of trying to understand where we're going, which is that, we live in a world where strategy exists. Strategy has been a company for 4 or 5 years, has been acquiring Bitcoin. There is an empirical relationship between that acquisition and their stock price. And we live in a world where Bitcoin is going to become more ubiquitous. We have to live in. That's where we're going. There isn't a lot of absolute specific terms. You can get into like the ethical things, or maybe some of the other guests we get into that of Bitcoin directionally. But I think it's pretty clear. I think there's going to be a large market that is interested in this. And I think that it makes sense to bring over these investor protections and things over to the Bitcoin and crypto space. And I would say, and crypto there, because my belief is that a lot of cryptocurrencies are essentially, securities anyway. I think this framework, being brought over to the crypto world was always going to happen, and these are just sort of Bitcoin native equities, right? So I don't know. I don't see them as some sort of exotic, instrument that is sort of destined to be a dustbin of history sort of model, right? It's like Bitcoin exists, public companies exist. The public company as a as an institution will continue, right? I think Saylor has also said that, right? So if the Bitcoin exists and the institution of a company, like a stock holding company, will continue to exist. These two things sort of have to come together and we have to reconcile them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Pete. There's a lot of Bitcoiners out there. I don't know if I'd say necessarily OGs, but a lot of Bitcoiners who have a platform who are critical of Bitcoin treasury companies for myriad reasons. So, is it because do you think a lot of Bitcoiners just never really got into finance or have dealt with equities? I find it interesting that a Bitcoiner would be critical of a company trying to stack as much Bitcoin as possible. Like that's what we're all doing, right?
Yeah, I think there's this yin and yang between, there's the individual ethos and self-sovereignty narrative around Bitcoin, which has been really popular. And then, companies are naturally collectives, right? The company is a collective of people. So they're, they do represent the interests of some group. But again, you look at the companies that have existed in the space, right? Like, so a good example would be like Coinbase, right? Coinbase has been public for 12 years. And the question now that people are asking is like, okay, well, why do they own Bitcoin? Like, why haven't they been buying it? And so now they're going out and buying it because they don't have the answer to that question. But that sort of proves the normative crypto perspective, was on the industry, which is that, when you think about disruption, right, there was this idea that Bitcoin was kind of take over everything. And then the reality is more murky, right? You sort of have interesting relics of history. Again, I go back to the printer. The printer is like a great, stupid technological device where it's like the internet was created. And so a lot of people made money off printers, like selling ink, like selling machines that you like stuffed paper in and then like printed did like that was a huge business. Like some of the people who made the most money off the internet being created sold a completely like totally ridiculous like derivative product that like you now would consider ridiculous. But it was almost for years, like, there was a 50-year period where literally everyone in the world had one. And now we don't live in that world anymore. But I think that the world is that's gonna be that long, right? It's gonna end probably as ridiculous. And so there's gonna be a lot of these like I call them the middle monkeys. You think about the evolution, there's the tadpole and then there's the man. And then there's all the monkeys in the middle, So you're going to go through all the monkeys in the middle. But so the question then from the Bitcoiners' perspective is, okay, well, are the treasury companies a monkey in the middle? And I think that the answer to that is more complicated because, again, if you go back to the idea of like companies exist and then companies have to deal with Bitcoin. And so, is Bitcoin going to completely replace the public company structure? Like in the crypto world, their answer to that was sort of yes, right? That's why they created like DAO. Like they almost view protocols as decentralized companies, right? And in many ways, they're like narrative framing around the creation of things like Ethereum. Like you had these concepts early in Bitcoin, like DAX, distributed and autonomous companies, which became DAOs, which are distributed autonomous organizations. And I think the normative view in crypto right now is like something sort of like all these protocols are sort of companies. And so I've always sort of tried to get people to realize that I actually think Saylor has done something really interesting, which is he's like put a lot of ideas into the space where I think the Bitcoin maximalist community has been sort of looking for a solution of like, okay, well, how do you get rid of altcoins? Like, we don't like altcoins. There's been a lot of different ideas. And, the idea that Bitcoin-backed equities can potentially do that is interesting, and Bitcoin-backed financial instruments can do that are interesting because they replace a lot of the qualities of the altcoin market. There's different tickers, there's different betas. And so Michael Saylor is now creating something that looks like a coin market cap for traditional companies. Taken, you know, some of what was created and removed like the technical abstraction that we don't like, right? Bitcoiners don't like that there's different backend protocol databases that are, kind of operating all these things. And you strip all those things out. Well, what do people want? They still want this sort of experience, right? And Taylor talks about this as well, right? They want different exposures, they want different upside, they want different duration. And so that becomes the sort of confection of products that you create market. And so, yeah, I think that like Saylor is now sort of innovating in Bitcoin in really interesting ways. A lot of the older Bitcoiners too, like have seen so many of these ideas and iterations fail in the crypto world. And so it's natural to like think that, you're experiencing something that will also be a fad. I just think that the public company is just like such an established human institution. It's almost as old as money itself, right? It's like the idea of the commercial institution. And so, yeah, I largely view it as like that institution has to adapt to Bitcoin. These companies are at the vanguard of that. And that question was easy to kind of get around before, I think, when Bitcoin was smaller, because a lot of the companies didn't use Bitcoin. I wasn't paid in Bitcoin at Coindesk. Like Coindesk didn't accept Bitcoin. Like the companies didn't actually really participate in the economy in a real way. That kind of like has happened later over time.
Yeah, I think the real big win of Bitcoin treasury companies is to see that these digital asset companies, 99.9% of them are building on Bitcoin rather than other coins. Of course, there are some Ethereum companies, and I don't follow any outside of the Bitcoin ones. But as someone who thinks that Bitcoin is the cryptocurrency that is money and not a security, like you say, as some of these other tokens, I'm happy to see that people are building on Bitcoin. So I want to touch on, you mentioned the company 21, Jack Mallers' company. That's his baby. He's partnered with Tether and with Softbank out of Japan. We're recording on December 12th, Friday. But this past week, they went live trading on the New York Stock Exchange and completed their SPAC deal. And yeah, I think one thing that I've really thought, and you touched on it earlier, is that this is a vehicle for Strike to kind of get acquired or merge into this company to really monetize those cash flows. Because as we've heard, there's rumblings that Strike is, just printing money as basically a pseudo Bitcoin exchange, I would say. How do you think 21 does monetize their business? Do you have any thoughts there, Pete?
Well, full disclosure, I do own some of 21. You can look at my portfolio on bitcointreasures.net, and I posted on my Twitter, so I do have a couple thousand dollars in 21. I don't know, but I think if anyone can build a Bitcoin business, it's Jack. I mean, Jack has a tremendous track record of actually shipping interesting Bitcoin native products. I mean, again, he has, as some critics like to point out, there is a failure rate on some of those products, right? I mean, his Lightning sort of payment rail products largely never got off the ground. I mean, Shrike was a Lightning, wallet sort of initially, and it did sort of track into being an exchange with a more traditional model. But I mean, again, I think if anybody can put the pieces together here and figure out how to make it work, Jack's a great candidate. He has a great, domain understanding of Bitcoin, the different open source technologies that power it, the different layers that power it. There's already some treasury companies that are doing stuff on the Lightning Network and monetizing that. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think Jack's just someone who has a great domain experience, and it goes back to I think everybody wants there to be sort of a magic solution here, and I think going back to the equities, Bitcoin-backed equities, you have to value those equities. You have to look at the team. You have to look at who's behind them, who's involved in them, with the knowledge that the rising tide of all boats getting lifted up is probably over, and only the strong will survive. Bitcoin will insulate some of these businesses, right? Their Bitcoin will be more valuable over time. Maybe they can be a zombie company for a little longer, but the strongest Bitcoin companies I think are going to become bigger, and I think you'll see a lot of acquisitions this year. I think you'll see a lot of mergers and companies getting together and trying to pool talent as they try to figure out an answer to this question. But as I said, I mean, I think with Jack, you're really getting the knowledge of the landscape and amount of capital and financing and backing that he has. So you have to sort of say if anyone has the answer. Knock on wood, it might be Jack. There's a lot of other companies though. Like even if you compare 21 to Block, I mean, Block's building Bitcoin miners. They've got Bitcoin processors being shipped around the world. They haven't added that Bitcoin treasury component as aggressively, but does that happen? Does Jack Dorsey kind of get involved? I mean, we'll see, right? I mean, how long can your stock be outperformed by the rest of the Bitcoin companies until you get more active? Who knows, right? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, it's been surprising to see him not jump in as much stacking Bitcoin, but he does have a very profitable business and can't knock somebody for focusing their energies certainly on growing that operating
Yeah, I think the
business.
mining with that one will be interesting, right? Like, I think that's been sort of treated as something that like was a bit of a dud story, when in reality, it's like the fact that the block even has like an active mining chip that is like the first mining chip produced out of China, that they're actually selling their own unique ASIC units. I mean, they're probably going to have problems trying to figure out that business. There's a lot of people who failed in the business. Mining is an incredibly tough business, and a lot of early Silicon Valley mining companies were completely wiped out by random companies from China. We're just really understood how to do the business model. And so, yeah, I mean, Block has cleared a significant hurdle. They're active in a market where the moat on this, for the two entrants who've been doing it is like 10 years. So that, there's most people know Bitmain and What's Miner, but like What's Miner was a derivative of Bitmain. It's literally like the guy who made the chips at Bitmain like left and started his own thing, right? So like most of the expertise on like developing, this really critical part of like the Bitcoin supply chain was really consolidated for a lot of years. And so, Block now has something else on the market, and that's very interesting. Again, whether that becomes something where they can actually gain a foothold in that business and disrupt it. You've heard out on social media, and I think it's probably true. That's the most centralized aspect of Bitcoin is the chip production for ASICs.
Hmm. Really interesting. So one more thing on the Bitcoin treasuries, Pete. We saw a strategy and Michael Saylor change their model to the preferred equity model to put leverage or amplification, as they call it, onto their balance sheet. Prior to that, most of the financing, other than the common stock issuance, was via convertible bonds.
Mm.
At the same time, we've kind of seen sentiment with strategy go down, even as their leverage has gone down. Some of that's a function of Bitcoin price. And, there's a lot of factors. Do you think that was a good choice to focus on the preferreds? And how do you think about preferreds moving forward?
Really, there was a problem with strategy this year is the common stock. And I think that sort of, for some people, killed the party a bit. I don't know the answer to that, right? I think that'll be another interesting thing to see. I think you'll see more companies try to launch preferred stocks. I think the question that all these companies are going to have to answer is how do they get shareholders involved? And that's, that goes beyond the sort of preferred equity, common equity question that you asked, which is just, these companies sort of made a lot of people a lot of money in a really short amount of time. That's kind of how people were getting involved. I think they have to build communities of people who are interested in companies that are differentiated. The unpopular truth is that Bitcoin treasury companies are going to have to become Bitcoin companies, right? And so they're just going to be Bitcoin companies, and then they're going to have to be differentiated enough to build, their own fandoms and groups. So like with MSTR and Block, it's like those are two differentiated companies. What differentiates them? Well, the products that they have actively in the market, the CEO and their vision, their ethos, like that's going to be what stockholders I think are looking for. But obviously, the more ways that you're diluting shareholders, shareholders I think they got wise, right? I think that they looked at what Michael Saylor was doing, and obviously it was great for the headlines and great for the balance sheet of the business, but a lot of them said, hey, maybe it's not for me. Maybe I should roll this MSTR over into Bitcoin. That was maybe the best choice. But I think it'll be interesting going forward, right? I don't know. I think the preferred equity, as I said, it introduces an interesting question that no one has resolved. Maybe someone will resolve it. Maybe they won't. Maybe that will become a less interesting model.
Yeah, really interesting to watch. We talked a little bit about the cycle and whether the Bitcoin cycle will continue. Obviously, the halving is having less and less of an impact. You have Trump trying to run the economy hot into the elections is something we expect. He's going to want to appoint governors to the Fed who are dovish. He gets to replace Powell as chair in the spring. Like you mentioned, you think we're going to see consolidation in the Bitcoin treasury space, and that may have an impact on the underlying Bitcoin price. So let's have a little fun, Pete. Just for fun, how many Bitcoin do you see Strategy owning at the end of 2026 next year?
Well, they're going to end this year at 210,000, right? I think they're about that right now. So that's a tough one. Nobody's asked me that one yet.
Yeah. Can they get to 850? Can they repeat 2025?
I'm going to say they're going to do about 100,000. I think that that's probably with these digital credit products. I think that's going to take a lot of marketing, and I think it's going to take a lot of seasoning of the market. I don't think the bull market's totally done, but I do think we're going to see some actual bear market in 2026. So I think they're going to underperform this year simply because so much of it was sort of the ATM type of programs this year sort of driving it. I think the digital credit one is going to be slow to catch on, but I think we've already seen that he's, done a couple 10,000 Bitcoin buys out of it, right? So I'm really, then I have to say, he's going to make 10,000 Bitcoin buys in 2026. I think that sounds reasonable. I think that's my guesstimate. I think he's going to end there. Maybe he ends at like 750. Again, I think like you'd really have to see the digital credit products like really take off in a big way. And I think that with the JP Morgan and Bank of America, there was some headlines this week of them kind of sniffing around these products. Well, they're going to have distribution. They're going to see potential competition. I'm going to say around 100. Maybe I'll say 120. I'll give him an extra 20,000.
Saylor, just like all of us, feels the FOMO. I love it. So thanks so much for the alpha, Pete. Definitely point people to your website and tell us where else we can follow you online.
Yeah, BitcoinTreasuries.net. You can follow us at BTC Treasuries on X, 24-hour news about the Bitcoin treasury sector if you'd like it there. We've got a newsletter that I definitely recommend you subscribe to. Comes out 2-3 times a week with insights from our analysts. We also do a monthly report, most recent of which was released this week. Takes a sort of deep dive into kind of the trends of the sector. So if you're really plugged in and you want to know kind of where we think the market is moving, definitely recommend that. Otherwise, I'm at Pete_Rizzo_ on X, and you can find a nice flow of news there from me. I'm a bit of a news junkie. And so, yeah, reach out on X if you want to get in touch. Obviously, we're building an interesting company too. So if you're interested in kind of data and information and kind of building a product that can connect Wall Street with the Bitcoin world, would love to chat.
Awesome, Pete. We'll put that all in the show notes. And one thing we have all our guests say before they leave is stay orange.
Okay, yeah, stay orange.
Ladies and gentlemen, the man tracking every corporate sat and turning data into narrative, Pete Rizzo.
Cheers, guys.